Okay. All right. Hey, Rita, how are you? Crazy Mama. Hey, Queen, how are you? Yeah, it was really, really kind of crazy today. Um, I don't know how many of you have been had your air quality affected by the Canadian wildfires, but got up this morning and progressively the sky just got more and more yellow, and yes, nuts. It was nuts. Not as bad as it was a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, I got up that morning, and the sky was orange, and I went outside, and it literally smelled like a campfire outside. It was crazy. Definitely apocalyptic looking, which kind of goes with what we're looking at tonight. All right. Well, before we get too deep into the weeds here, we are going to get started. Thank you all for bearing with me there for a minute while I got my shit together. Well, thank you, Susie Q. I appreciate you. Let's see. Okay. Alrighty then. Well, good evening, everyone. And welcome back to Storytime with UndeadPapa. Hey, Danielle. Welcome. Tonight, we witness the end of worlds. A lonely farmer watches history raced past him. A civilization faces an unimaginable future, and a single star appears in the heavens, bringing with it the greatest catastrophe humanity has ever known. Science fiction has always asked the biggest questions. Not only what if, but what happens next. So wherever you're listening from, dim the lights, sit back and relax, because story time is about to begin. Amy, you are definitely not late. You are in fact right on time. Our first story tonight is The Highway by Ray Bradbury. Got my secret stay awake juice. Hey CZ, how are you? The cooling afternoon rain had come over the valley, touching the corn in the tilled mountain fields, tapping on the dry grass roof of the hut. In the rainy darkness, the woman ground corn between cakes of lava rock, working steadily. In the wet lightlessness, somewhere a baby cried. Hernando stood, waiting for the rain to cease so he might take the wooden plow into the field again. Below, the river boiled brown and thickened in its course. The concrete highway, another river, did not flow at all. It lay shining, empty. A car had not come along it in an hour. This was in itself of unusual interest. Over the years, there had not been an hour when a car had not pulled up, someone shouting, "Hey there, can we take your picture?" Someone with a box that clicked and a coin in his hand. If he walked slowly across the field without his hat, sometimes they called, "Oh, we want you with your hat on." And they waved their hands, rich with gold things that told time or identified them, or did nothing at all but winked like spiders' eyes in the sun. So he would turn and go back to get his hat. His wife spoke. "Something is wrong, Hernando?" "See, the road. Something big has happened, something big to make the road so empty this way. He walked from the hut slowly and easily, the rain washing over the twinned shoes of grass and thick tire rubber he wore. He remembered very well the incident of this pair of shoes. The tire had come into the hut with violence one night, exploding the chickens and the pots apart. It had come alone, rolling swiftly. The car off which it had come had rushed on as far as the curve and hung a moment, headlights reflected, before plunging into the river. The car was still there. One might see it on a good day when the river ran slow and the mud cleared. Deep under, shining its metal long and low and very rich, lay the car. But then the mud came in again, and you saw nothing. The following day he had carved the shoe soles from the tire rubber. He reached the highway now and stood upon it, listening to the small sounds it made in the sun. Then, suddenly, as if at a signal, the cars came. Hundreds of them, miles of them, rushing and rushing as he stood, by and by him. The big, long, black cars heading north toward the United States, roaring, taking the curves at too great a speed, with a ceaseless blowing and honking, and there was something about the faces of the people packed into the cars, something which dropped him into a deep silence. He stood back and let the cars roar on. He counted them until he tired. 500, 1,000 cars passed, and there was something in the faces of all of them. But they moved too swiftly for him to tell what this thing was. Finally, the silence and emptiness returned. The swift, long, low convertible cars were gone. He heard the last horn fade. The road was empty again. It had been a funeral cortege, but a wild one. It had been like a funeral cortege, but a wild one, racing, hair out, screaming to some ceremony ever northward. Why? He could only shake his head and rub his fingers softly at his sides. Now, all alone, a final car. There was something very, very final about it. Down the mountain road, in the thin, cool rain, fuming up great clouds of steam, came an old Ford. It was traveling as swiftly as it might. He expected it to break apart any instant. When this ancient Ford saw Hernando, it pulled up, caked with mud and rusted, the radiator bubbling angrily. "May we have some water, please, senor?" A young man, perhaps 21, was driving. He wore a yellow sweater, an open-collared white shirt, and gray pants. In the topless car, the rain fell upon him, and 5 young women packed so they could not move in the interior. They were all very pretty, and they were keeping the rain from themselves and the driver with old newspapers. But the rain got through to them, soaking their bright dresses, soaking the young man. His hair was plastered with rain. But they did not seem to care. None complained, and this was unusual. Always before they complained of rain, of heat, of time, of cold, of distance. Hernando nodded. "I'll bring you water." "Oh, please hurry," one of the girls cried. She sounded very high and afraid. There was no impatience in her, only an asking out of fear. For the first time, Hernando ran when a tourist asked. Always before he had walked slower at such requests. He returned with a hub lid full of water. This, too, had been a gift from the highway. One afternoon it had sailed like a flung coin into his field, round and glittering. The car to which it belonged had slid on, oblivious to the fact that it had lost a silver eye. Until now, he and his wife had used it for washing and cooking. It made a fine bowl. As he poured the water into the boiling water, Hernando looked up at their stricken faces. "Oh, thank you, said one of the girls. "You don't know what this means." Hernando smiled. "So much traffic in this hour. It all goes one way, north." He did not mean to say anything to hurt them, but when he looked up again, there all of them sat in the rain, and they were crying. They were crying very hard. And the young man was trying to stop them by laying his hands on their shoulders and shaking them gently one at a time, but they held their papers over their heads, and their mouths moved, and their eyes were shut, and their faces changed color, and they cried, some loud, some soft. Hernando stood with the half-empty lid in his fingers. "I did not mean to say anything, senor," he apologized. "That's all right," said the driver. "What is wrong, senor?" "Haven't you heard?" replied the young man, turning, holding tightly to the wheel with one hand leaning forward. "It's happened." This was bad. The others, at this, cried still harder, holding on to each other, forgetting the newspapers, letting the rain fall and mingle with their tears. Hernando stiffened. He put the rest of the water into the radiator. He looked at the sky, which was black with storm. He looked at the river rushing. He felt the asphalt under his shoes. He came to the side of the car. The young man took his hand and gave him a peso. "No," Hernando gave it back. "It is my pleasure." "Thank you. You're so kind," said one of the girls, still sobbing. "Oh, Mama, Papa, oh, I want to be home. I want to be home. Oh, Mama, Dad." And others held her. "I did not hear, senor," said Hernando quietly. "The war!" shouted the young man, as if no one could hear. "It's come! The atom war, the end of the world!" "Senor, senor," said Hernando. Thank you for your help. Goodbye," said the young man. "Goodbye," they all said in the rain, not seeing him. He stood while the car engaged its gears and rattled off down, fading away through the valley. Finally it was gone, with the young women in it, the last car, the newspapers held and fluttered over their heads. Hernando did not move for a long time. The rain ran very cold down his cheeks and along his fingers and into the woven garment on his legs. He held his breath, waiting, tight and tensed. He watched the highway, but it did not move again. He doubted that it would move much for a very long time. The rain stopped. The sky broke through the clouds. In 10 minutes the storm was gone, like a bad breath. A sweet wind blew the smell of the jungle up to him. He could hear the river moving gently and easily on its own way. The jungle was very green. Everything was fresh. He walked down through the field to his house and picked up his plow. With his hands on it, he looked at the sky, beginning to burn hot with the sun. His wife called out from her work. "What happened, Hernando?" "It is nothing," he replied. He set the plow in the furrow. He called sharply to his burro, and they walked together through the rich field, under the clearing sky, on their tilled land by the deep river. "What do they mean, the world?" he said. And that one is short and sweet. Ah, crap. See, this is what I'm talking about. I didn't get the... I didn't get stuff set. Yeah, and it's all messed up. So, crud. All right, well, we're just going to keep it at that for now. Okay. I am wholly unprepared tonight, so yeah, I hit the button and there's nothing there because I didn't have it ready because I was late. So, go figure. Well, I hope everybody is doing well tonight. Let's see. Gotta be very disorganized. So, the end of the world can look very different depending on where you're standing. For Hernando, it was something distant, something carried past him by frightened strangers on an empty highway. But our next story takes us far beyond the world we knew, to a future where humanity has changed and survival has come at a terrible cost. This is The Great Cold by Frank Belknap Long. And just as a note, this story was first published in Astounding Stories in February of 1935. The little web-footed man swam through the dark sea. With chest forward and lungs distended, he breasted the wide current, gliding evenly between iridescent jellies and parrot-beaked fish. As he swam, enormous eyes stared at him, and dangling tentacles caressed his limbs. He swam without fear, for he was in a charted area of harmless food-giving plants and animals, and his mission was a pleasant one. Altering his course, he descended in a straight line towards a cluster of spongy jellyfish. As he floated gracefully above it, he turned swiftly on his back and thrust downward with his legs. The sharp cutter attached to his heel went deeply into the soft mass. Again and again he thrust. The dislodged mass ascended, and he seized it in his teeth. Turning about in the water, he swam slowly to the surface. The water was black with human heads as he broke the golden surface film. All about him, others of his kind moved swiftly shoreward with clusters of soft foodstuffs dangling from their thin lips. Far ahead, black rocks towered. Centuries of erosion had worn and compressed them, and the great sun now bathed them in an amber radiance as it declined slowly in a circle of fire. At the base of the mile-high cliffs, the summits of the barnacle masters glistened with a luster as of wind-glazed sandstone. Their summits protruded slightly above the water, and luminous shadows moved behind their yawning valves. To the web-footed man, these shadows were more omniscient than the mysterious forces which had created him, for the swollen bodies of the majestic lords of the sea and the enormous complex minds of their capitulums had set stern limits to his willing and relentless conditioned behavior. Beside him in the warm sea, another man was swimming. His body was feeble, his mind fearless. In his persistent human way, he strove to pierce the dark, heavy veil which concealed the future. As he swam cliffward, he spoke in a sibilant whisper. "Clulan, they intend to shrink us. They have decided that we are less alert than our mates, that our fingers are clumsy, our bodies uncouth. They admire the slim, graceful bodies and agile minds of our mates. To diminish our ugliness, they will shrivel our bodies and minds, as the forces of nature have shriveled the males of their own kind." Clulan shuddered, and a feeling of dread pervaded his little being. He turned slowly upon his back and said, 10 million years ago, Sla, When the glory of terrestrial dominance enveloped our little race, the tall ones had minute complementary mates. It was always so, and they have grown indifferent to the shame and humiliation. But if they shrink us, our mates will soon despise us." "That is true, Clulan," agreed Sla in a grim tone. Sla, being weak of body, was seldom sent forth on food-gathering missions. As a wise and able servitor of the barnacle masters in the chemical caverns, he was privileged to glimpse the future dimly, to behold vaguely prefigured the vast, stupendous dreams of perfection which were continually taking shape in the minds of the crustacean overlords. He knew that the barnacle masters dreamed hideously of world dominion in their white shell towers. For millions of years they had contended with the great land invertebrates for terrestrial supremacy, working secretly with obscure chemicals and vegetable ferments to transform their own bodies and the bodies of their tiny human serfs. Their ultimate aim was the complete destruction of the insect hordes which held the continents in servile bondage. More relentless than the insects, they moved grimly toward appalling ends. Their dream of perfection was immediate, personal. Lacking the selfless minds of the ants and bees, they dreamed of gluttonous absorption, of sense-channeled delights. Swaying immense in their tall shells, they sought to surround themselves with purely nutritive pleasures. It was the females who dreamed thus. The little shrunken males were mere complimentary mockeries which scuttled ignominiously about in the vicinity of their mates. The sense of contempt tinged with mockery which the female barnacles experienced in the presence of their compliments flowed outward and enveloped their little human servitors. With a kind of malignant cosmic irony, they dreamed of restoring the balance in a lowly sphere of being by making the woman of the human race as relatively enormous as themselves and reducing the male to physical and mental insignificance. It was an utterly malicious dream evoked by enforced idleness, the product of immense power-seeking to sate itself in trivial cruelties. The two little swimmers were now abreast of a great circular summit of the barnacle shells. Seizing hold of a ladder-shaped polyp, they ascended the rounded eminence and flicked the water from their bodies. The surface which supported them was vibrant with slow, rhythmic movements of the barnacle masters in their sea-immersed houses. Through tiny slits in the summits of the domed shells, they could glimpse the great forms within as they floated upright in slothful majesty. Clulan sighed in bitter foreboding, gazed downward and outward at the jasper sea beneath, and the tiny human forms that flecked it. Thousands of little figures were disporting themselves in cliffward curving swells, some still diving for foodstuffs, and others merely swimming for recreation. Clulan looked at Sla. "Will you return at once to the laboratories?" he asked. Sla nodded. "Yes, Clulan. All is in readiness there. The new glandular secretion will be poured from its immense vat before the sun grows bright again." Clulan's face was taut with apprehension. "And is this gland substance which they will inject into our veins to shrivel and perhaps destroy us?" "Yes," assented Sla. "They have wrought such incredible technical miracles in the last sun cycle, Clulan, that they are mad with impatience to release their slumbering creativeness on some one or something. In another cycle they will subdue the continents as they have subdued the sea. But they are still unprepared for that awful and titanic conflict."
The hive and tunnel hordes are still too wary, too powerful, but the chemical caverns hold much that is terrible even now. Immense troughs of corrosive plants, body-transforming chemicals. In another cycle they will enwrap the terrestrial sphere in flame and carnage.
A shudder convulsed Cluland's small body. He looked downward through a dark, sun-baked slit in the shell at the wavering bulk beneath. It seemed almost unbelievable to him that a form so majestic and omniscient should harbor such malice. Awe and adoration contended with rebellious resentment in his mind. If they did that to him, could he still loyally serve them?
Sla said, "I must go now, Clulan. Perhaps they will pity us in the end. All of us who have selflessly served will prostrate ourselves in humble supplication when the great vat turns and the gland substance streams forth. We will plead for you and for ourselves, but chiefly for you who swim in the depths and have mates who love you. We are feeble of body, and if they shrink us," he shrugged, "it will not matter so much."
He turned then and moved swiftly towards a round, dark aperture in the cliff wall. Hundreds of similar vents dotted the immense stone surface behind the summits of the barnacle shells, some leading to the laboratory caverns in the sunless depths of subterranean arteries cut into the cliff's spacious interior. Others to dark food chambers where the garnishings of the little servitors rested in frigid containers against moisture-dripping walls. Still other apertures led to the rectangular dwelling chambers of the servitors and their mates. In pitying sorrow, Clulan watched the stooped and emaciated form of the laboratory worker advance toward the vent and disappear. He sighed, took one last somber look at the sun-reddened sea far beneath, and walked swiftly toward the only aperture which led to peace and serenity and momentary forgetfulness in the blue depths of the tall cliff. He walked slowly along a low, damp passage, stooping from time to time to avoid grazing his scalp against low-hanging stalactites and sharp projections in the solid rock. For an interminable distance he repeated those stoopings, passing farther and farther into the cliff, his little human mind shredding its grim fears and growing more serene as he advanced. Presently light burst upon his vision, and he emerged into a rectangular chamber with burnished stone walls and a sloping floor of veined feldspar. As he emerged from the tunnel, a slim white form arose from a recumbent position and advanced toward him. She was a creature of unusual loveliness, with large, dark eyes and wondrously curving lashes, her pale skin and long silvery hair which descended fan-wise to her waist endowed her with an elusive, almost ghostly beauty as she stood waiting expectantly in the center of the chamber. With joyful exclamation he advanced and clasped her. Her lips softly caressed his bearded face as he pressed her to him. Gently he twined his fingers in her hair and turned them slowly about, inflicting a slight, tender pain. For an instant their cheeks met in sudden ecstasy, then slowly, reluctantly, he released her. She stood looking at him with glowing eyes. "You look tired," she murmured, "my sweet little one." It was a term of endearment which she had used 1,000 times in the course of their life together. But now the adjective sent a cold chill to the core of his being. He trembled, turned pale. Her eyes widened in surprise.
"Why, what is the matter, my little one?"
He uttered a muffled groan and stopped her mouth with his hand. Then he led her firmly to a reposed slab in the wall and settled down beside her. Her eyes met his in a troubled stare.
"What is it, Clulan?" she pleaded. "I await the truth without fear. Have you met someone who—"
Clulan shook his head, ran his palm tenderly over her cheeks and forehead.
"There will never be another," he said. "You know that, Mutal. We are one body, one mind forever." "Then what is it?" "I swam shoreward with the laboratory worker Sla. He knows many things which have been concealed from the food gatherers. The tall ones intend to—" He bit his lips. "Yes, Clulan."
"They intend to shrink us." Horror flared in the woman's eyes. She sat bolt upright in tremulous apprehension.
"You mean they will shrivel our bodies, Clulan?"
"They will not shrivel your body, Mutal," replied Clulan. "They will shrivel mine. They have found no adequate outlet for the immense energies which consume them. They are too feeble as yet to wage war on the tunnel and the hive hordes, but they can amuse themselves by tormenting us. The pitiful smallness of their own mates has taught them contempt for all males. We are ridiculous in their sight, and they intend to torture and humiliate us." The woman's lips were trembling.
"But can they do that, Clulan? Have they discovered a way?"
"They can easily alter our bodies, Mutal," said the little food gatherer. "A million years ago we had no webs between our toes. In the dim ages of the comet's dust, when changes to the Earth's atmosphere immeasurably aided in their development, and the development of the tunnel hordes, and our little kind nearly perished beneath the weight of the Antarctic glaciations, there were no web-footed men. The men who now serve the tunnel and hive hordes are not web-footed. In their deep, dark tunnels they walk with primitive toes. Then the tall ones injected glandular secretions from the web-footed mammals into the veins of our ancestors, and by slow stages we developed these hideous appendages. There is still something in us, a deeply buried instinctive loathing which will not down. That is why we experience shame when we gaze upon our feet, which are so abnormal, so monstrous." He made a curious, sobbing sound in his throat. "Our feet are ugly, but more hideous still will be this new change, which will destroy what we treasure most, the tie that unites us, the sense of wonder and release which we experience when we are together. You will despise me, Mutal."
"If they shrivel your body, Clulan," said Mutal in a grim, tortured tone, "I will swim deeply into the water and die. I will never—"
Her speech was arrested by a sudden flare of prismatic light. Clulan's gaze leapt upward. The circular visual transmitter in the chamber's roof was streaked with rapidly alternating banners of green and orange light. Across its glazed surface, the signals wavered in ominous sequence. Mutal gripped her mate's wrist with her thin fingers, sinking her nails into his flesh until he cried out in pain.
"Clulon," she murmured, "it is for you. Your colors. One of the tall ones has gone mad."
The blood drained from the little food-gatherer's face as he stared. More terrible than any threat of shrinkage was the task to which he had been summoned. The hideous ordeal beneath the sea which would tax his energies beyond endurance and perhaps destroy him. With a choking cry, Mutal seized his head and drew it to her bosom. Tenderly she wept over him, swaying as she gazed deep into his tortured eyes. She was familiar with the grim menace that lurked in the depths of the tall barnacle shell, and as her terrified mind envisioned the nerve-wracking descent to the poisoned capitulum and the glaring mania in the eyes of the afflicted tall one, she clutched Clulon more firmly and refused to release him. Wallowing in their tall houses, the female barnacles were not immune to disease. Weakened by slothful living and the slacking of pernicious emotional urges, the huge, complicated minds in their capitulums occasionally cracked beneath the strain. So horrible was the ensuing disharmony that the mad forms became a menace to the entire community, which only the little human servitors could surmount. So tiny that they could slip with ease between the deadly, slashing tentacles of the mad ones, they were privileged to attack the great bodies with poisoned cutters, becoming for a moment, in that strange reversion of function, more powerful than the titan shapes they served. But the penalty of that brief usurpation of power was usually an appalling one, death lurking in every flick of the wildly weaving tentacles. Gently, but with grim tenacity, Clulon untwined Mutal's arms and drew himself up. His eyes were aglow with social consecration and the horrible caprices of the barnacles. Their cold and arbitrary cruelties were for the instant forgotten. Once in a sun cycle, a barnacle went mad, and once in 20 sun cycles, one of the little food gatherers was summoned by the visual transmitter to contend with that awful horror in the depths. The task fell alternately on laboratory workers, valve tenders, storehouse guards, and food gatherers. But it was now the food gatherers' turn, and among 100,000 potential saviors, Clulon was the elected one. The tiny, consecrated purger of the community of barnacles, more powerful and omniscient in this little tour of dedication than the 20,000 tall ones who majestically in their fathom-deep houses usurped the continental coast. Mutal cried out to him in hysterical dismay and attempted to restrain him as he moved toward the tunnel entrance, twining her arms about his legs. Tenderly, but with firmness, he released himself, pressed his nose to her forehead, and stepped into the tunnel. Swiftly he sped along it, dodging the stalactites with agile dexterity as he neared the cliff opening, a shrill undulation impinging on his hearing and grew quickly louder as he pounded onward. It was a grimly ominous sound, and in his haste to emerge, he nearly stumbled onto the slippery stones beneath. His heart was thudding furiously, and his breath came in spasmodic jerks. There were no longer any tiny human swimmers in the cliffward surging waves when he emerged and descended with incredible speed to the nearest domed shell. He stood for an instant on the summit of the dome, staring downward at the immense stretch of glistening water beneath him.
The sun was very low now, and the waves were the hue of the blood in his veins. A few gulls skimmed the unruffled surface far out, swooping, shrieking. To steady himself, he gazed at the immense purplish arc of the heavens. His swift visual appraisement had imbued him with a sickening vertigo, a diffuse and queer kind of agony. It was as though a sharp cutter had rasped the edges of every nerve in his body. Directly beneath him, about the sea-laved circumference of the great shell, the water was black with the dead of his kind. Thousands of little men and women floated there in the churning current. The great barnacle, in its madness, had sucked in all of the happy swimmers and spewed them forth with delirious rage.
It was the barnacle directly beneath him which had gone mad. Through the long cracks in the shell's summit he caught furtive glimpses of something huge and wet moving loathsomely about in an unnatural animation. And as he stared, the ululation arose suddenly to intensify his terror, swelling till it deafened him, and then subsiding and rising again. And when it fell to a thin, hideous wailing, a churning sound from below usurped its function, and Clulon knew that the bodies of the crushed and mangled swimmers were flowing once more into the deep shell, drawn inward in the wake of a relentless suction. A hand fastened on Clulon's shoulder. He turned about in swift affright, then slowly the startled look faded from his countenance. "Come with me quickly, Clulon," said the little laboratory worker. He was standing, shivering on the dome, his thin body bent cliffward in urgent entreaty. Without a word, Clulon followed him. They entered the laboratory aperture and passed swiftly between the long tiers of low-hanging stalactites. Presently the passage widened, and they emerged into a cavern so enormous that its sloping roof was lost in swirling vapors 500 feet above their heads. In a grim awe, Clulon followed his guide across the great chamber, passing unbelievable marvels as he progressed. Enormous metallic vats 100 feet in height, with luminous dials and slowly revolving crystal wheels shining and flashing in the half-light, translucent spore-breeding cylinders filled with many-hued growths so brilliant in hue that they cast a spell upon his senses, causing his eyes to smart and his brain to reel with a sick revulsion. Cyclopean tiers of loathsome fungus tubes, containing in their blue-lighted interior growths more malignant than the virulent plants of the ant hordes. 1,000 contrivances and repositories, cyclopean and hideous, glowing with technical menace, the fruit of millenniums of experimentation in the depths of the tall cliff. Clulon followed Sla to the base of a thin, inverted funnel of startling transparency which arose from a square, elevated base and spiraled upward in the uncertain light till it was lost in the mists above. Behind the bright surface, a dark liquid rose and fell in the center of the funnel. Sla swiftly thrust out his little hand and turned a metallic control mechanism at the base of the structure. The darkness deep within seemed to deepen and settle down in circular folds. The laboratory worker said, "Give me your cutters, Clulon." Clulon sat down and drew the cutters from his heel. He handed the sharp implements to Sla without a word. The muscles in his jaw were twitching. Sla held the cutters firmly and advanced upon the funnel. With steady aim, he hurled both cutters directly at the dark fluid. There was a tinkling murmur, as if little bells a-jangle as the thin protective coating tore across. The cutters were enveloped by the dark fluid. For an instant, Slaw stood in silence, waiting for them to grow cold with a frigidity that was beyond anything to his little race, known to his little race in the days of its supremacy. Presently, from his loose body covering of translucent chill, Slaw drew a thin, sharp metallic instrument, and two soft pads of cold-resisting ditonite. Holding the thin instrument securely, he stepped forward, pierced the transparent surface skin of the funnel, and drew out the two cutters. He slipped them quickly and securely over Clulan's ditonite-encased heels. It's ditonite-encased heels, yeah. "We must hurry," he whispered in a tense tone. The two tiny forms moved rapidly across the chamber. As Clulan's feet glided over the floor, there arose a low hissing sound, and a thin blue vapor curled upward and enveloped his little person. "If the cutters touch your flesh, you will die in agony," warned Slaw. They passed between towering vats and tubes and horizontal discs slowly revolving. A look of terror was stenciled on Clulan's countenance as he progressed. He looked fearfully upward at the most menacing of the enormous vats, a rectangular bulk with burnished surface, flecked with immense luminous eyes that seemed to glare malignantly down at him in the gloom. He sensed, however, that the eyes were in reality pouring vents through which the interior substance would descend in gluttonous streams when the great lever at the base of the container moved downward. "The gland vat?" he asked, clutching Slaw's arm and pointing. His voice was tremulous with foreboding. "No," said Slaw. "The gland vat is over there." He turned slightly and gestured toward the shadows behind him. "But what is that, then?" "The great cold is resting there," replied Slaw in a grim tone. Clulan was near the dark inner entrance of the cliff-piercing tunnel, but at Slaw's words he stopped abruptly, as though the cold in the cutters had penetrated his body, his mind. The great cold. Rumors, legends of it had penetrated... Rumors, legends of it had penetrated even to the little abode chambers of the food gatherers in the cliffs. "It would freeze all the seas between the continents," murmured Clulan, parroting statements he had heard as his own ancestors had once mechanically repeated the names of mighty deities without form or substance, as they squatted in terror in lonely fire-etched hills in the early Pleistocene dawn. "It would destroy all life in the oceans. It would shrivel and kill every living thing." Slaw was gripping his arm, urging him onward. "We must hurry," he entreated. Clulan shivered, threw off with an effort his panicky inertia. He passed into the tunnel and sped swiftly along. Slaw followed, murmuring feverish advice to his thin, tremulous voice, "When you strike, thrust deeply. Avoid the soft parts. Strike directly at the base of the capitulum." The hideous ululations of the mad barnacle increased ominously in volume as they neared the outer world. Clulan was the first to emerge. He ran swiftly along a sloping ledge of rock on the cliff surface. Holy crap. Excuse me. He ran swiftly along a sloping ledge on the cliff's face and leaped downward to the rounded summit of the great shell. Sla followed. For an instant the two little figures swayed unsteadily in the twilight. Then Clulan raised his palm and pressed it to the other's forehead in comradely salute.
"Farewell, Sla," he said. "You have been a loyal and generous friend."
Speedily he divested himself of his outer body covering of translucent shill. His little frame gleamed ruddily as he stood for an instant on the extremity of the sloping summit.
"Strike boldly and avoid the lashing tentacles,"
warned Sla with tears in his voice. Grimly, Clulan nodded. Raising his arms, he leapt vigorously outward and descended in a swift, graceful arc to the darkling water beneath. His tiny body cleaved the surface film and descended deeply. The water was no longer warm. As he righted himself in the purple depths, something cold and rigid collided with his extremities. For an instant he stared through a wavering film of white, sightless eyes set in a pain-racked countenance. Tiny, luminous crustaceans had clustered thickly about the hair of the submerged corpse, casting a ghostly radiance on its swollen features. With reluctance, Clulan raised his leg and lashed at the gruesome obstruction with the cutter attached to his heel. The dead man dived as the cutter pierced him. The awful cold seared his flesh in an instant, and his body fell apart and descended in 2 fragments. Clulan knew then that he was armed with a technical weapon more deadly and effective than death ray or fungus spore, and a renewed confidence surged up within him. He swam slowly toward the towering shell. The water grew brighter as he drew nearer to it. And presently, through a murky film, he saw the square mouth of a fathom-deep valve. His little countenance set in tense lines as he turned slowly about far under the sea and swam with even strokes toward the immense mad shape in the center of the shell. The water within was a churning maelstrom. As he passed through the valve, an ascending current caught him up and drew him swiftly in the direction of the demented Tall One's great crested capitulum. The capitulums quivered with pure-blind squirmings and lashings, and the attached elastic peduncle, 100 feet in width, was distended in fury. Nearer and nearer to the great form he swirled. 2 long, tentacular legs ascended from their rigid sheaths and shot towards him. He turned swiftly and lashed at them with his feet. One divided and fell away in the depths. The other knotted itself in swift menace. He plunged frantically downward as the circle of death shot past him, missing his little form by the fraction of a foot. He turned over and over in the water. The current carried him swiftly upward again, in a straight line toward the barnacle's capitulum. 100 feet it towered in the dark brine, its hooded summit glued to the great shell far above, its blood-red lower segments quivering menacingly in the tides. It swelled as he shot toward it. Straight into it he plunged, keeping his little body poised with swift and frenzied arm lashings and manipulating the cutters with deadly accuracy. Twice the unearthly cold seared the great form's swollen bulk as Clulan's heels cut across it. For an instant The little food gatherer swirled about in the unimpeded current. Then 2 more tentacles arose, churning the dark water as they darted toward him. He plunged between their noose-like coils and returned to the swollen head. Again and again he jabbed at it with his heels. The entire capitulum quivered as the cutters pierced it. Then, horribly, the lower segments dived and fell away, descending into the black depths beneath. Quivering downward, they sank, carrying their hideous seeds of madness, until nothing remained of the great shape but a drained and empty hood that swayed sluggishly in the tides. Relief and joy flooded Clulan's tiny being. He turned exultantly about in the darkness and swam with robust strokes to the surface of the water. As he emerged beneath the dome, a small black shape scuttled quickly forward toward him. From its lair beneath the summit of the great shell, the little male barnacle had watched the glare slowly fade from the hood of its mate, had heard the frenzied ululations diminish and subside. It hung suspended from a rock ledge immediately above the swimming form of the little food-gatherer, and watched him intently as he cleaved the black water. A kind of bestial joy, degraded and mirthless, was stamped on every lineament of the small, wrinkled head. Remind me, I have a story about barnacles. How are we doing, Tessa? As Clulan floundered, it stretched forth a thin leg and lifted him from the water. Setting him firmly on the ledge, it retreated a pace with a shrill cry. Clulan knew then he was safe, that the little form would not harm him. In its degenerate, nearly mindless fashion, it was convulsed with gratitude. As Clulan rested on the ledge, staring at the little creature's joy-contorted head, his exultation vanished, and a great wave of horror and loathing flooded his being. He remembered. He understood. With relentless clarity, the menace that overhung the males of his own little race returned hideously to his mind and assumed a sickening imminence. He had contended in vain the dark water. His reward would be eternal shame and ignominy, and there could be no peace for him beneath the glimmering constellations. The little barnacle felt no sorrow. It was consumed with a cold and hellish joy, a degenerate gratitude. Its long bondage was over. It was free now to starve slowly beside its slain mate. And even the wet rot which would soon consume its shriveled body segments would be less difficult to bear than the shame it had endured in life. It was to Clulan's credit that he was incapable of self-deception. He perceived with realistic clarity that he would hate his dear little one with consuming hate if they shriveled him. And when she died, his brain grew cold with the horror of the image that loomed. He got up, stared for an instant at the little barnacle with consuming pity. Then he turned and ascended swiftly to the surface of the dome. Dexterously he heaved himself up over wet and glistening rock projections and emerged through a crevice in the surface of the great shell. Hundreds of tiny white forms came flocking about him with joyous cries. Foremost in the throng was his little mate, and his gaze enveloped her. A brief, fierce joy surged up in him again. He took her with avid huggings to his bosom. The encircling men and women prostrated themselves before him, clung to his wet legs, embraced his shoulders with worshipful cries. It was his little hour of victory. For a brief moment, Clulin towered godlike beneath the gleaming net of stars that spanned the luminous skyway above him. Sla touched his arm, whispered in awe, "A moment such as this is worth all the years of tedious striving, Clulan. All these people would die for you in an instant. They would hurl themselves into the waves below at your command. It is the intoxication of power, Clulan, the intoxication of glory. Your heroism flows out to them. They identify themselves with you, share your triumphs. As I stand here beside you, I can feel the current flowing outward. It envelops me, and I share in the glory and power. Great deeds ennoble Clulan. They seem to exist in themselves as sentient realities, and when their aura descends upon us, we must become transfigured, transformed. Are you not proud, Clulan?" Gently, Clulan set Mutal down, turned about till he was staring directly into the worshipful eyes of the little laboratory worker. "I am not proud, Sla. I am ashamed. We are the heirs of a mean destiny. Yet if I should dare boldly now—" Madly, the little figures continued to press about him, shouting, chanting, extolling his heroism in a frenzy of adoration. He swayed for an instant in the press, holding Mutal grimly to him with his vigorous right arm as though reluctant to relinquish her precious slender form. Excuse me. To relinquish all the sweetness and wonder that had sustained his little life for so long. Mutal murmured, "You are tired, my dear little one. Let us go quickly into the rock." Clulan drew her swiftly to him, welded his countenance to hers. For an instant, tears stung his eyelids. Then he freed himself, stood erect. "Come!" he shouted. The throng divided in wonder as he advanced across the domed shell and entered the laboratory vent. In the dark entrance he paused an instant, raised his hand in fervent appeal. "Follow me," he cried. Down the wide tunnel he sped. Beneath the uneven stone roof his little forms leaped forward with chest outthrust and head thrown back in exultant triumph. A sense of godlike power flooded his midget being. 5,000 of his kind followed swiftly at his heels. Sla ran beside him, clutching at his arm in sudden apprehension. "Go with Mutal into the rock," he panted. "You are tired, distraught. You are violating the sanctity of this cavern. Give heed to me, Clulan. You are courting disaster." But Clulan was deaf to advice. He sped onward, turning from time to beckon and shout, and presently he was in the great cavern itself, and the little forms that obeyed him blindly were all about him, awaiting his commands. With a kind of ocular majesty, he flung up his arm and pointed into the shadows toward the towering receptacle of the great cold. "Climb up, all of you. Pull down that lever." Exclamations of terror and amazement burst from the throats of the little servitors who adored him. Some fell prone in supplication and entreaty, torn between reluctance and desire. Others turned and fled with with paling cheeks, but the majority obeyed his grim command. They ascended with shrill cries, clustering upon the immense metallic lever till it was completely covered with their small white bodies. For a moment the midget shapes twisted and turned in the dim blue-lighted cavern, high in the air above Clulan's swaying form. Then, slowly, terribly, the squirming human mass descended, and the great vat turned. As the lever moved downward, the vat slanted, and the luminous eyes far above opened automatically in its cyclopean bulk. The glow vanished, and a dark opacity usurped the pouring vents, and wrapped in the white flame of a superhuman daring, Clulan gazed swiftly about him. He was not alone on the ground. Several of the little men and women had ignored his command and were standing entwined in one another's arms, oblivious of the horror that loomed. As his gaze swept the unheeding forms, all the exaltation and power seemed to ebb from him, to flow away in a dark, remorseless tide. He swayed backward in mute agony. As he did so, a slender woman emerged from the shadows and ran swiftly toward him. Encircling him with her arms, she pressed her cheek fervently to his and stared fearlessly upwards. Her silver hair descended fanwise to her waist, giving her a spectral look in the vast dim cavern. From somewhere near at hand, the voice of the little laboratory worker said, "Farewell, Clulan. Death is a dark, bitter fruit, but the core is luminous, Clulan. When the rind is gone, all the darkness will vanish forever." Clulan felt suddenly godlike. Enwrapped in a sustaining aura of love and friendship, he stared upward with unwavering vision into the dark, dropping face of the great cold. "You are wrong, Sla," he said quietly. "The entire fruit is luminous now." As he spoke, the great cold descended upon him in a black, engulfing wave and spread slowly outward, ending forever his rebellious human dream and the long, bright noon of the barnacles. Well, yeah. Of course it did. That's one of those ones that's like, if you're not paying attention, you're going to miss the point. It is so good, though. It is so good. Frank Belknap Long is one that I'm going to be reading more of as we go forward, because the guy's a freaking genius. The guy is a freaking genius. Alrighty then. I believe I have read one of his other stories maybe a month ago. And for the life of me, I cannot remember what it is. But that's okay. I don't mind. What is the magical barnacle story? It just reminds me. Okay, so for those of you that are familiar with SpongeBob SquarePants, one of the insults that gets thrown around quite often on that show is calling one character calling another a barnacle head. So Oh yes, War of the Worlds and Time Machine are on the list. I'm just trying to figure them out as to how I'm going to fit them in. But tonight's H.G. Wells is one of his short stories that I actually was not aware existed until a couple months ago. Anyway, the first Christmas that I was in my house, the first Christmas that I was divorced, after the divorce and we had separated houses and all that stuff, and the kids were with me for Christmas or leading up to Christmas. So one night they went to bed, and I put up the Christmas tree. Didn't decorate it. I just put it up, turned it on. And the next morning, my oldest comes downstairs, and she's all excited. Ho, 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 ho. And she gets down there, and she's just... And she's like, the tree. And she's like, oh my God, it's freaking me out, you know? And then my youngest comes down the stairs, and, you know, of course, my oldest is like presenting the tree to her, like, oh my God, you know? And so when I put the tree together, I forgot to take off the tags that said, this is part number 1, and this is part number 2, and this is part number 3, so you know which way to stack them. Well, the tags were still on there, and they're like, my oldest is like, why does it say number 1 and number 2 and number 3? And I'm like, don't know. Maybe that's just the tags. I don't know. My youngest goes, where? I don't see. And of course, my oldest goes, it's right there. And she points it out. And as she's walking away, and I've got this all on video, as she's walking away, she goes, you barnacle head. And I cannot, every time I watch that video, I just start laughing. It's probably only a cute story to me, but I just think it's hilarious. Barnacle head. You barnacle head. Of course, to this day, my kids are 18 and coming up on 21. And we will still occasionally, like when my youngest daughter was home, not last summer, but the summer before, from the UK, the three of us actually sat down and watched the entirety of season 1 of SpongeBob SquarePants because, yeah, it's funny. So, Journey to the Center of the Earth is a good one, and it's actually, one thing I found about Jules Verne is that his stuff is actually quite long, so it's something that I would have to put over the span of a couple of nights, possibly 3 or 4 in some cases. But it's definitely on my list. Just working out the logistics, you know. Yes, one of my favorite episodes is when SpongeBob and Patrick read a curse word that is on the dumpster outside the Krusty Krab. And it's one of those sentence enhancers, like Patrick says, and it's whenever they say the word, it comes out like a dolphin squeak, and the following events of that in that episode are just hilarious. It is one of my favorite episodes. That's the dolphin sounds are just perfect. And then Mr. Krabs is, you know, you kiss your mother with that mouth, you know. And then of course he stubs his toe and, you know, proceeds to use 13 bad words. My favorite moment in that episode is, there are 13 bad words. And Squidward's like, don't you mean there's 7? Of course, Mr. Krabs, not if you're a sailor. It's like, yep. And of course, the joke is that he's referring to the 7 words you cannot say on television skit by George Carlin, which if you've never heard it, go look it up. It is hilarious. It is one of the best comedy routines of the last 50, 60 years. It is freaking phenomenal. If you need to know, it is on George Carlin's album Class Clown. So, yeah. I love SpongeBob. SpongeBob is one of those shows where adults can watch it and get almost get more out of it than kids. Tessa, we could do the Who's on First, which is another one of those comedy skits that is just absolutely timeless. It makes me laugh every time I watch it. The Abbott and Costello, every time I watch it, it makes me laugh without fail. Without fail. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, one of my favorite episodes of SpongeBob is there's an episode where it cuts to SpongeBob sitting in a chair and leaning forward, and he's got his eyes wide, and he's and then it cuts to the TV, and it's this sea anemone waving back and forth, and then Gary comes up behind him and goes, wow, and it's SpongeBob immediately grabs the remote and changes it to football. It's like, oh, Gary, I was just watching some football. And I thought about the first time I saw it, I had to stop and I went, wait a minute. SpongeBob just got busted watching undersea porn. Like, oh my goodness. Oh, the driver's license episodes. You never gave up. You never took the easy way out, Mrs. Puff. When she sneaks in and has to sabotage his freaking boatmobile. I actually bought the Lego Krusty Krab set when it came out, and the main reason I bought that is because it had the Krabby Patty mobile as part of the kit. Yeah. Because everybody loves the Krusty Krab pizza episode. It's not a boulder, it's a rock. All right. Oh, goodness. I could go on for days. Yes, the marching band. Is mayonnaise an instrument? No, Patrick. Mayonnaise is not an instrument. And then when Sandy puts him in the freaking trombone. To the owner of the white sedan, you left your lights on. I'm just, no, I can't. I'm just like done. Not with that attitude. Oh, awesome! I loved it. The bone flute story was really cool. That was really cool. I enjoyed that one. I'm glad you liked it. Thank you for the feedback on that, because that tells me that that's one that 6-7 months from now I can actually I can read it again and people will actually respond to it. They'll be like, oh, hey, I remember this story, which is really cool. Which is definitely really cool. Anyway, I should get back to telling stories because that's what y'all come in here for, right? Not to listen to me talk about SpongeBob SquarePants, which I could do all freaking day. If you haven't figured that out yet. Still, one of my favorite lines from television. If I were to die right now in some sort of fiery explosion due to the carelessness of a friend, well, that'd just be okay. Up at 4? Are you you're insane. You're insane. Oh. You're insane. I would totally. You know what? That could be a thing on my Discord server. That could be a thing. We could do a SpongeBob night where we could call it UndeadPapa's favorite SpongeBob episodes. Oh, yes. We're all a little mad here. All right, enough of that. Well, as soon as I get the server stood up, I will be letting you guys know. All right, let's get on with the last story here. So in our last story, the end came not from the sky, but from those who ruled beneath it. Power, fear, and desperation brought an entire age to its final moment. But now, We turn our eyes upward to a single light growing brighter and closer with every passing night. This is The Star by H.G. Wells. I got nothing to click. I didn't have time to set everything up, so I have nothing to click. There's no clicking. I can't click, sadly. I wish I could click, but I cannot click. Hello over there on the tubes. It's good to see you, then. I swear I'm not ignoring you. Let's see. All right, so The Star by H.G. Wells. It was on the first day of the new year that the announcement was made, almost simultaneously from 3 observatories, that the motion of the planet Neptune, the outermost of all the planets that wheel about the sun, had become very erratic. Ogilvy had already called attention to a suspected retardation in its velocity in December. Such a piece of news was scarcely calculated to interest a world the greater portion of whose inhabitants were unaware of the existence of the planet Neptune, nor outside the astronomical profession did the subsequent discovery of a faint remote speck of light in the region of the perturbed planet cause any very great excitement. Scientific people, however, found the intelligence remarkable enough even before it became known that the new body was rapidly growing larger and brighter, that its motion was quite different from the orderly progress of the planets, and that the deflection of Neptune and its satellite was becoming now of an unprecedented kind. Few people without a training in science can realize the huge isolation of the solar system. The sun, with its specks of planets, its dust of planetoids, and its impalpable comets, swims in a vacant immensity that almost defeats the imagination. Beyond the orbit of Neptune there is space, vacant so far as human observation has penetrated, without warmth or light or sound, blank emptiness for 20 million times a million miles. That is the smallest estimate of the distance to be traversed before the very nearest of the stars is attained. And saving a few comets, more unsubstantial than the thinnest flame, no matter had ever to human knowledge crossed this gulf of space until early in the 20th century, when this strange wanderer appeared. A vast mass of matter it was, bulky, heavy, rushing without warning out of the black mystery of the sky into the radiance of the sun. By the second day it was clearly visible to any decent instrument as a speck with a barely sensible diameter, in the constellation Leo near Regulus. In a little while an opera glass could attain it. On the 3rd day of the new year, the newspaper readers of 2 hemispheres were made aware for the first time of the real importance of this unusual apparition in the heavens. A planetary collision, one London paper headed the news and proclaimed Duchesne's opinion that this strange new planet would probably collide with Neptune. The leader writers enlarged upon this topic so that in most of the capitals of the world on January 3rd there was an expectation, however vague, of some imminent phenomena in the sky. And as the night followed the sunset round the globe, thousands of men turned their eyes skyward to see the old familiar stars, just as they had always been. Until it was dawn in London, and Pollux setting and the stars overhead grown pale, the winter's dawn it was, a sickly, filtering accumulation of daylight. And the light of gas and candles shone yellow in the windows to show where people were astir. But the yawning policeman saw the thing, The busy crowds in the market stopped to gape, workmen going to their work betimes, milkmen, the drivers of news carts, dissipation going home, jaded, pale, homeless wanderers, sentinels on their beats. And in the country, laborers trudging afield, poachers slinking home, all over the dusky, quickening country it could be seen. And out at sea, by seamen watching for the day, the great white star comes suddenly into the westward sky. Brighter it was than any star in our skies, brighter than the evening star at its brightest. It still glowed out white and large, no mere twinkling spot of light, but a small, round, clear, shining disk, an hour after the day had come. And where science has not reached, men stared and feared, telling one another of the wars and pestilences that are foreshadowed by these fiery signs in the heavens. Sturdy Boers, dusky Hottentots, Gold Coast Negroes, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Portuguese stood in the warmth of the sunrise, watching the setting of this strange new star. And in 100 observatories there had been suppressed excitement, rising almost to a shouting pitch, as the two remote bodies had rushed together and are hurrying to and fro to gather photographic apparatus and spectroscope, and this appliance and that to record this novel, astonishing sight, the destruction of a world. For it was a world, a sister planet of our Earth, far greater than our Earth indeed, that had so suddenly flashed into flaming death. Neptune it was, had been struck fairly and squarely by the strange planet from outer space, and the heat of the concussion had incontinently turned to two solid globes into one vast mass of incandescence. Round the world that day, 2 hours before the dawn, went the pallid great white star, fading only as it sank westward and the sun mounted above it. Everywhere men marveled at it, but of all those who saw it none could have marveled more than those sailors, habitual watchers of the stars, who far away at sea had heard nothing of its advent and saw it now rise like a pygmy moon and climb zenithward and hang overhead and sink westward with the passing of the night. And when it next rose over Europe, everywhere were crowds of watchers on hilly slopes, on house roofs, in open spaces, staring eastward for the rising of the great new star. It rose with a white glow in front of it, like the glare of a white flare, and those who had seen it come into existence the night before cried out at the sight of it. "It is larger," they cried. "It is brighter." And indeed the moon, a quarter full and sinking in the west, was in its apparent size beyond comparison, but scarcely in all its breadth had it as much brightness now as the little circle of the strange new star. "It is brighter," cried the people clustering in the streets. But in the dim observations the watchers held their breath and peered at one another. "It is nearer," they said. "Nearer." A voice after voice repeated, "It is nearer." And the clicking telegraph took that up, and it trembled along telephone wires, and in 1,000 cities grimy compositor fingered the type. It is nearer. Men writing in offices, struck with a strange realization, flung down their pens. Men talking in 1,000 places suddenly came upon a grotesque possibility in these words: "It is nearer." It hurried along wakening streets. It was shouted down the frost-stilled ways of quiet villages. Men who had read these things from the throbbing tape stood in yellow-lit doorways, shouting the news to the passer-by. "It is nearer!" Pretty women, flushed and glittering, heard the news told jestingly between the dances and feigned an intelligent interest they did not feel. Nearer, indeed! How curious! How very, very clever people must be to find out things like that. Lonely tramps faring through the wintry night murmured those words to comfort themselves, looking skyward. It has need to be nearer, for the night's as cold as charity. Don't see much warmth from it if it is nearer, all the same. "What is a new star to me?" cried the weeping woman kneeling beside her dead. The schoolboy, rising early for his examination work, puzzled it out for himself, with the great white star shining broad and bright through the frost flowers of his window. Centripetal, he said, with his chin on his fist. Stop a planet in its flight, rob it of its centrifugal force. What then? Centripetal has it, and down it falls into the sun, and this... Do we come in the way? I wonder. The light of that day went the way of its brethren, and with the latter watches of the frosty darkness rose the strange star again. And it was now so bright that the waxing moon seemed but a pale yellow ghost of itself, hanging huge in the sunset. In a South African city a great man had married, and the streets were alight to welcome his return with his bride. "Even the skies have illuminated," said the flatterer. Under Capricorn, two Negro lovers daring the wild beasts and evil spirits for love of one another crouched together in a canebrake where the fireflies hovered. "That is our star," they whispered, and felt strangely comforted by the sweet brilliance of its light. The master mathematician sat in his private room and pushed the papers from him. His calculations were already finished. In a small white phial there still remained a little of the drug that had kept him awake and active for 4 long nights. Each day, serene, explicit, patient as ever, he had given his lecture to his students, and then had come back at once to his momentous calculation. His face was grave, a little drawn and hectic from his drugged activity. For some time he seemed lost in thought. Then he went to the window, and the blind went up with a click. Halfway up the sky, over the clustering roofs, chimneys, and steeples of the city, hung the star. He looked at it as one might look into the eyes of a brave enemy. "You may kill me," he said after silence, "but I can hold you, and all the universe for that matter, in the grip of this little brain. I would not change even now." He looked at the little phial. "There will be no need of sleep again," he said. The next day, at noon, punctual to the minute, he entered his lecture theatre, put his hat on the end of the table as his habit was, and carefully selected a large piece of chalk. It was a joke among his students that he could not lecture without that piece of chalk to fumble in his fingers, and once he had been stricken to impotence by their hiding his supply. He came and looked under his gray eyebrows at the rising tiers of young, fresh faces, and spoke with his accustomed studied commonness of phrasing. "Circumstances have arisen," "Circumstances beyond my control," he said, and paused, "which will debar me from completing the course I had designed. It would seem, gentlemen, if I may put the thing clearly and briefly, that man has lived in vain." The students glanced at one another. Had they heard right? Mad? Raised eyebrows and grinning lips there were, but one or two faces remained intent upon his calm, grey-tinged face. "It will be interesting," he was saying, "to devote this morning to an exposition, so far as I can make it clear to you, of the calculations that have led me to this conclusion. Let us assume—" He turned towards the blackboard, meditating on a diagram in the way that was usual to him. "What was that about lived in vain?" whispered one student to another. "Listen," said the other, nodding towards the lecturer, and presently they began to understand. That night the star rose later, for its proper eastward motion had carried it some way across Leo towards Virgo, and its brightness was so great that the sky became a luminous blue as it rose, and every star was hidden in its turn, save only Jupiter near the zenith, Capella, Aldebaran, Sirius, and the pointers of Bear. It was very white and beautiful. In many parts of the world that night a pallid halo encircled about it. It was perceptibly larger. In the clear refractive sky of the tropics it seemed as if it were nearly a quarter the size of the moon. The frost was still on the ground in England, but the world was as brightly lit as if it were midsummer night. One could see to read quite ordinary print by that cold, clear light, and in the cities the lamps burnt yellow and wan. And everywhere the world was awake that night, and throughout Christendom a sombre murmur hung in the keen air over the countryside like the belling of bees in the heather. And this murmurous tumult grew to a clangor in the cities. It was the tolling of the bells in a million belfry towers and steeples, summoning the people to sleep no more, to sin no more, but to gather in their churches and pray. And overhead, growing larger and brighter as the earth rolled on its way and the night passed, rose the dazzling star. And the streets and houses were alight, and all the cities, the shipyards glared, and whatever roads led to high country were lit and crowded all night long. And in all the seas about the civilized lands the ships were throbbing engines, and ships with bellying sails crowded with men and living creatures were standing out to ocean and the north. For already the warning of the master mathematician had been telegraphed all over the world and translated into 100 tongues. The new planet and Neptune, locked in a fiery embrace, were whirling headlong ever faster and faster towards the sun. Already, every second, this blazing mass flew 100 miles, and every second its terrific velocity increased. As it flew now, indeed, it must pass 100 million miles wide of the earth and scarcely affect it. But near its destined path, as yet only slightly perturbed, spun the mighty planet Jupiter and his moons, sweeping splendid around the sun. Every moment now, the attraction between the fiery star and the greatest of the planets grew stronger. And the result of that attraction? Inevitably, Jupiter would be deflected from its orbit into an elliptical path, and the burning star, swung by his attraction wide of its sunward rush, would describe a curved path, and perhaps collide with, and certainly pass very close to our Earth. Earthquakes, volcanic outbreaks, cyclones, sea waves, floods, and a steady rise in temperature to know I not what limit, so prophesies the master mathematician. And overhead, to carry out his words, lonely and cold and livid, blazed the star of the coming doom. To many who stared at it that night until their eyes ached, it seemed that it was visibly approaching. That night, too, the weather changed, and the frost that had gripped all Central Europe and France and England softened towards a thaw. But you must not imagine, because I have spoken of people praying through the night and people going aboard ships and people fleeing towards mountainous country, that the whole world was already in a terror because of the star. As a matter of fact, use and want still ruled the world, and save for the talk of idle moments and the splendor of the night, 9 human beings out of 10 were still busy at their common occupations. In all the cities, the shops, save one here and there, opened and closed at their proper hours. The doctor and the undertaker plied their trades. The workers gathered in factories. Soldiers drilled. Scholars studied. Lovers sought one another. Thieves lurked and fled. Politicians planned their schemes. The presses of the newspapers roared through the night. And many a priest of this church and that would not open his holy building to further what he considered a foolish panic. The newspapers insisted on the lesson of the year 1000, for then, too, people had anticipated the end. The star was no star, mere gas, a comet. And were it a star, it could not possibly strike the earth. There was no precedent for such a thing. Common sense was sturdy everywhere, scornful, jesting, a little inclined to persecute the obdurate fearful. That night, at 7:15 by Greenwich time, the star would be at its nearest to Jupiter. Then the world would see the turn things would take. The master mathematician's grim warnings were treated by many as so much more mere elaborate self-advertisement. Common sense at last, a little heated by argument, signified its unalterable convictions by going to bed. So, too, barbarism and savagery, already tired of the novelty, went about their nightly business. And save for a howling dog here and there, the beast world left the star unheeded. And yet, when at last the watchers in the European states saw the star rise an hour later, it is true, but no larger than it had been the night before, there were still plenty awake to laugh at the master mathematician, to take the danger as if it had passed. But hereafter the laughter ceased. The star grew. It grew with a terrible steadiness, hour after hour, a little larger each hour, a little nearer the midnight zenith, and brighter, until it had turned night into a second day. Had it come straight to the earth instead of in a curved path, had it lost no velocity to Jupiter, it must have leapt the intervening gulf in a day. But as it was, it took 5 days altogether to come by our planet. The next night it had come to a third the size of the moon before it set to English eyes, and the thaw was assured. It rose over America near the size of the moon, but blinding white to look at and hot, and a breath of hot wind blew now with its rising and gathering strength, and in Virginia
and Brazil, and down the St. Lawrence Valley it shone intermittently through a driving reek of thunderclouds, flickering violet lightning, and hail unprecedented. In Manitoba was a thaw and devastating floods, and upon all the mountains of the earth the snow and ice began to melt that night, and all the rivers coming out of high country flowed thick and turbid, and soon, in their upper reaches, with swirling trees and bodies of beasts and men, they rose steadily into the ghostly brilliance, and came trickling over their banks at last, behind the flying population of their valley. And along the coast of Argentina and up the South Atlantic, the tides were higher than they had ever been in the memory of man, and the storms drove the waters in many cases scores of miles inland, drowning whole cities. And so great grew the heat during the night that the rising of the sun was like the coming of a shadow. The earthquakes began and grew until all down America, from the Arctic Circle to Cape Horn, hillsides were sliding, fissures were opening, and houses and walls crumbling to destruction. The whole side of Cotopaxi slipped out in one vast convulsion. A tumult of lava poured out so high and broad and swift and liquid that in one day it reached the sea. So the Star, with the wan moon in its wake, marched across the Pacific, trailed the thunderstorms like the hem of a robe, and the growing tidal wave that toiled behind it, frothing and eager, poured over island, and swept them clear of men, until that wave came at last with a blinding light, and with the breath of a furnace, swift and terrible it came, a wall of water 50 feet high, roaring hungrily upon the long coasts of Asia, and swept inland across the plains of China. For a space the Star, hotter now and larger and brighter than the sun in its strength, showed with pitiless brilliance the wide and populous country, towns and villages with their pagodas and trees, roads wide, cultivated fields, millions of sleepless people staring in helpless terror at the incandescent sky. And then, low and growing, came the murmur of the flood. And thus it was with millions of men that night, a flight now hither, with limbs heavy with heat and breath fierce and scant, and the flood like a wall, swift and white behind, and then death. China was lit, glowing white, but over Japan and Java and all the islands of eastern Asia, the great star was a ball of dull red fire, because of the steam and smoke and ashes the volcanoes were spouting forth to salute its coming. Above was the lava, hot gases and ash, and below the seething floods, and the whole earth swayed and rumbled with the earthquake shocks. Soon the immemorial snows of Tibet and the Himalaya were melting and pouring down by 10 million deepening, converging channels upon the plains of Burma and Hindustan. The tangled summits of the Indian jungles were aflame in 1,000 places, and below the hurrying waters around the stems were dark objects that still struggled feebly and reflected the blood-red tongues of fire. And in a rudderless confusion, a multitude of men and women fled down the broad riverways to that one last hope of men, the open sea. Larger grew the star, and larger, hotter and brighter with a terrible swiftness now. The tropical ocean had lost its phosphorescence, and the whirling steam rose ghostly wreaths from the black waves that plunged incessantly, speckled with storm-tossed ships.
And then came a wonder. It seemed to those who in Europe watched for the rising of the star that the world must have ceased its rotation. In 1,000 open spaces of dawn and upland, the people who had fled thither from the floods and the falling houses and sliding slopes of hill watched for that rising in vain. Hour followed hour through a terrible suspense, and the star rose not. Once again, men set their eyes upon the old constellations they had counted lost to them forever. In England it was hot and clear overhead, though the ground quivered perpetually. But in the tropics, Sirius and Capella and Aldebaran showed through the veil of steam. And when at last the great star rose near 10 hours late, the sun rose close upon it, and in the center of its white heart was a disk of black. Over Asia it was the star had begun to fall behind the movement of the sky, and then suddenly, as it hung over India, its light had been veiled. All the plain of India, from the mouth of the Indus to the mouths of the Ganges, was a shallow waste of shining water, that night out of which rose temples and palaces, mounds and hills black with people. Every minaret was a clustering mass of people, who fell one by one into the turbid waters, as heat and terror overcame them. The whole land seemed a wailing, and suddenly there swept a shadow across the furnace of despair, and a breath of cold wind, and a gathering of clouds out of the cooling air. Men looking up, near blinded at the star, saw that a black disk was creeping across the light. It was the moon, coming between the star and the earth. And even as men cried to God at this respite, out of the east with a strange, inexplicable swiftness sprang the sun. And then star, sun, and moon rushed together across the heavens. So it was presently to the European watchers. Star and sun rose close upon each other, drove headlong for a space, and then slower, and at last came to rest. Star and sun merged into one glare of flame at the zenith of the sky. The moon no longer eclipsed the star, but was lost to sight in the brilliance of the sky. And though those who were still alive regarded it for the most part with that dull stupidity of hunger, fatigue, heat, and despair engender, there were still men who could perceive the meaning of these signs. Star and earth had been at their nearest, had swung about one another, and the star had passed. Already it was receding, swifter and swifter in the last stage of its headlong journey downward into the sun. And then the clouds gathered, blotting out the vision of the sky. The thunder and lightning wove a garment round the world. All over the earth was such a downpour of rain as men had never before seen. And where the volcanoes flared red against the cold canopy, there descended torrents of mud. Everywhere the waters were pouring off the land, leaving mud-silted ruins, and the earth littered like a storm-worn beach with all that had floated, and the dead bodies of the men and brutes, its children. For days the water streamed off the land, sweeping away soil and trees and houses in the way, and piling huge dikes and scooping out titanic gullies over the countryside. Those were the days of darkness that followed the star and the heat. All through them, and for many weeks and months, the earthquakes continued. But the star had passed, and men, hunger-driven and gathering courage only slowly, might creep back to their ruined cities, buried granaries, and sodden fields. Such few ships as had escaped the storms of that time came stunned and shattered and sounding their way cautiously through the new marks and shoals of once familiar ports. And as the storms subsided, men perceived that everywhere the days were hotter than of yore, and the sun larger, and the moon shrunk to a third of its former size, took now 80 days between its new and new. But of the new brotherhood that grew presently among men, of the saving of laws and books and machines, of the strange change that had come over Iceland and Greenland and the shores of Baffin Bay, so that the sailors coming there presently found them green and gracious, and could scarce believe their eyes, this story does not tell. Nor of the movement of mankind now that the earth was hotter northward and southward toward the poles of the earth. It concerns itself only with the coming and the passing of the star. The Martian astronomers, for there are astronomers on Mars, although they are very different beings from men, were naturally profoundly interested by these things. They saw them from their own standpoint, of course. Considering the mass and temperature of the missile that was flung through our solar system into the sun, one wrote, it is astonishing what little damage the earth, which it missed so narrowly, has sustained. All the familiar continental markings and the masses of the seas remain intact, and indeed the only difference seems to be a shrinkage of the white discolorization, supposed to be frozen water, round either pole, which only shows how small the vastest of human catastrophes may seem at the distance of a few million miles. There we go. Yeah, I know. I haven't really figured the sign out yet. It doesn't want to sit the way I want it to, but I'll figure it out. Yeah, that one, I don't know. I probably should have warned you guys, but that was, yeah. It's one of H.G. Wells' more known short stories, but most people just don't know that one. So, well, I am going to call it a night because it is now 11:08. And I'm tired and I need to go to bed. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. So, and that's where I'll leave our stories tonight. Thank you all for spending a little time with me around the fire tonight. Join me Friday for The Haunted and the Haunters by Lord Edward Bulwer Lytton. If you enjoy these stories and would like to help support what I do here, please consider becoming a superfan or visiting the UndeadPapa Mercantile, which is linked in my bio. Every bit of support helps keep the campfire lit. Until then, please be kind to each other. And be kind to yourself, because kindness matters. And so do you. Good night, everybody.